The final hours of Jesus may not have unfolded in the way most people have been taught, not merely because a few details are uncertain, not because one gospel remembers a color differently, or because an ancient copyist misplaced a word. The difficulty is much deeper. When the traditional passion narrative is examined as we would examine any other ancient document carefully, comparatively, without assuming its conclusion in advance, the story begins to fracture. 10 specific problems emerge. They are not hidden in obscure manuscripts locked beneath the Vatican. They can be found in the gospel accounts themselves, in ancient historical sources, and in the scholarship taught within seminaries. Yet they rarely reach the people sitting in church on Sunday morning. Why? Because the version most believers receive is not any single gospel account. It is a harmonized narrative, a smooth reconstruction assembled from 4 different texts, with contradictions softened, missing details supplied from another author, and incompatible scenes presented as though they formed one continuous eyewitness report. Baruch Spinoza challenged this way of reading Scripture more than 3 centuries ago. He argued that sacred texts should not be protected from examination simply because communities call them sacred. A document must be studied through its language, historical setting, authorship, internal structure, and relationship to the world outside it. That principle sounds simple, but once applied consistently, it becomes dangerous to every institution that depends upon unquestioned interpretation. The question is not whether the passion narrative possesses emotional power. It clearly does. The question is whether the traditional sequence of events could have occurred exactly as it has been preached, painted, dramatized, and repeated for centuries. To answer that, we must begin with the first extraordinary event. Fact number 1. 3 hours of darkness that no independent observer recorded. Mark, Matthew, and Luke all describe darkness descending during the crucifixion. According to these accounts, from approximately noon until 3 in the afternoon, the land was covered in darkness. Luke intensifies the image by saying that the light of the sun failed. Pause and consider the scale of that claim. This was not a cloud passing over a hill outside an isolated village. The scene is placed during Passover, when Jerusalem was crowded with pilgrims arriving from across the Roman world. The city and its surrounding roads would have been filled with merchants, priests, soldiers, travelers, officials, families, and foreign visitors. A sudden darkness lasting 3 hours in the middle of the day would not have been a private religious sign. It would have been a public natural catastrophe, or a supernatural event visible to thousands. People would have panicked. Animals would have reacted. Temple activity would have been disrupted. Travelers would have carried the story home. Administrators would have recorded it. Astronomers and natural philosophers would have attempted to explain it. Yet when we turn from the gospel narrative to the surviving historical world around it, the darkness disappears. Pliny the Elder spent enormous effort cataloging unusual events in nature. His work includes eclipses, atmospheric disturbances, strange celestial appearances, earthquakes, storms, and other phenomena reported throughout the known world. He does not mention 3 hours of darkness over Judea. Seneca wrote about natural events and cosmic disturbances. He says nothing. Josephus documented political unrest, religious conflict, unusual signs, military violence, and incidents in Judea involving far fewer people than would have witnessed such darkness. He does not record it. Ancient astronomers in China preserved observations of eclipses and other celestial events with remarkable care. There is no record of a 3-hour failure of sunlight corresponding to the crucifixion story. No Egyptian chronicler describes it. No surviving Roman administrator reports it. No Jewish historian pauses to explain it. No pagan observer appears to have noticed that daylight vanished for 3 hours over one of the most politically sensitive regions of the empire. This silence matters. Absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Many events in antiquity went unrecorded. Documents were destroyed. Archives disappeared. Ordinary lives passed without leaving a written trace. But extraordinary claims create different expectations. The greater the public scale of an alleged event, the more difficult it becomes to explain complete silence. A private conversation may vanish from history. A local dispute may leave no record. But 3 hours of midday darkness during a major pilgrimage festival should have entered multiple streams of memory. The traditional explanation sometimes appeals to a solar eclipse. Yet Passover occurs at the time of a full moon, while a solar eclipse requires a new moon. Even setting that astronomical problem aside, a total solar eclipse lasts minutes, not 3 hours. The more reasonable explanation is literary rather than astronomical. The Gospel writers were drawing upon the prophetic language of the Hebrew Scriptures. The prophet Amos spoke of a day when the sun would go down at noon and the earth would become dark in broad daylight. In prophetic literature, cosmic darkness represents judgment, catastrophe, divine confrontation, and the collapse of an old order. From this perspective, the darkness is not an observation from a witness carefully recording the sky. It is theological imagery. It tells the audience how the death should be understood. The authors are not merely saying that a man died. They are saying that creation itself entered mourning. That distinction is crucial. A symbol may contain profound meaning without being a literal event. But when symbolism is preached as historical reporting, the reader is no longer being asked to interpret a text. The reader is being asked to suspend the standards normally used to distinguish literature from history. And this is where Spinoza's method becomes unsettling. He asks us not to begin with the belief that the event must have happened. He asks us to begin with the text, the historical environment, and the available evidence. If the description resembles prophetic language, if no independent source confirms it, and if the natural explanation is astronomically implausible, then the rational conclusion is that the darkness belongs to the architecture of the narrative. It was written to reveal meaning. It was not recorded to preserve weather. But the darkness is only the first event allegedly occurring at the moment of Jesus' death. Fact number 2. The veil of the temple was torn, and no priest left a record of it. The Gospels say that when Jesus died, the curtain of the temple was split in two from top to bottom. For modern readers, the word curtain may create the wrong image. This was not a decorative piece of fabric hanging behind an altar. The veil belonged to the most sacred complex in Jewish religious life. It separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies, the inner chamber associated with the presence of God. Access was severely restricted. According to tradition, only the high priest entered the innermost sanctuary, and only on the Day of Atonement. Josephus, who had seen the temple before its destruction, described an enormous and richly woven veil made with blue, purple, scarlet, and fine linen. It was part of a sacred institution maintained by a large priestly system. During Passover, the temple would have been intensely active, watched by priests, attendants, worshippers, and guards. Now imagine what the gospel claim requires us to believe. At approximately 3 in the afternoon, during one of the busiest religious moments of the year, the barrier guarding Judaism's most sacred chamber suddenly tore from its highest point to its lowest. If this occurred, it would not have been treated as routine damage. It would have produced terror. Was God abandoning the sanctuary? Had the covenant been violated? Was judgment approaching? Had someone committed sacrilege? The priests would have inspected the damage immediately. Religious authorities would have debated its meaning. Repairs would have been required. Stories would have spread throughout Jerusalem. The event would have entered Jewish memory, whether interpreted as punishment, warning, desecration, or omen. Yet Josephus does not report it. This silence is especially striking because Josephus came from a priestly family and wrote extensively about the temple, its rituals, its architecture, its internal conflicts, and its destruction. The rabbinic traditions preserved in the Talmud do not describe the veil being torn at the death of Jesus. Philo of Alexandria, who wrote deeply about Jewish worship and symbolism during the 1st century, does not mention it. No surviving priestly source records that the most sacred barrier in Jerusalem was suddenly split during Passover. Again, the event appears only where its theological meaning is needed. The symbolism is clear. The death of Jesus removes the barrier between humanity and the divine. The old separation has ended. Access to God is no longer controlled by temple boundaries, priestly mediation, or sacred architecture. As theology, the image is powerful. As a historical claim, it stands alone. This is not an insignificant distinction. When a metaphor is written in the form of an event, later readers may forget that they are encountering theology expressed through narrative. They may begin to defend the physical occurrence, as though the spiritual meaning depends upon it. But meaning does not become stronger simply because we force symbolism into history. In fact, understanding the literary construction may reveal more about the author's intention. The torn veil is not random. It is placed at the precise moment of death because the writer wants the crucifixion to transform the structure of sacred reality. The question, then, is not merely, did the curtain tear? The deeper question is, what was the writer attempting to declare by describing it? Spinoza's approach requires us to separate those questions. One concerns historical evidence. The other concerns literary and theological purpose. Confusing them protects belief from examination, but it also prevents us from understanding how the narrative was created. Two extraordinary events have now appeared at the same moment. The sun darkens for 3 hours, yet no independent observer records it. The temple veil tears in the most guarded sacred space in Jerusalem, yet no priest preserves the event. Both scenes carry unmistakable symbolic meaning. Both are absent from the external historical record. Both become easier to understand when read as composition rather than reportage. And yet the third event goes further than either of them. It is not merely darkness in the sky. It is not merely a torn veil inside the temple. It is a claim that the dead opened their eyes, left their tombs, and walked publicly into Jerusalem. That is where the narrative moves from symbolic catastrophe towards something even more impossible to ignore. Fact number 3. The dead saints who walked through Jerusalem. This claim appears only in the Gospel of Matthew. According to Matthew, when Jesus died, the earth shook, rocks split, tombs opened, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised. After Jesus' resurrection, these figures came out of their tombs, entered Jerusalem, and appeared to many people. Read the claim without rushing past it. Not one person returned from the dead. Many did. They did not remain hidden near their graves. They entered the holy city. They appeared publicly to numerous witnesses in Jerusalem during Passover, when the city was overflowing with pilgrims. This is not described as a dream, a private vision, or a symbolic experience inside the mind of a grieving disciple. Matthew presents it as a public event. Bodies emerged from tombs. Recognizable dead people walked through the streets. Many citizens saw them. If this had occurred, it would have been more immediately verifiable than the later claim of an empty tomb. Families would have recognized the people who had died. Priests would have been forced to respond. Roman officials would have received reports of unrest, panic, or religious excitement. The entire city would have been transformed by the event. Imagine Jerusalem at that moment. Narrow streets crowded with travelers, markets overflowing, priests moving through the temple precincts, Roman troops watching closely for political disturbance, families gathering for the feast. Then the dead begin appearing. Not hidden spirits, not anonymous shadows. People, individuals who had been buried, mourned, and remembered. Such an event would not have remained inside a single gospel written decades later. It would have become one of the most discussed episodes in the history of the Roman world. Yet Mark says nothing. This matters because Mark is generally regarded as the earliest surviving gospel and was one of the primary sources used by Matthew. Mark describes the crucifixion, the darkness, and the tearing of the temple veil, but he does not mention tombs opening or dead saints entering Jerusalem. Luke says nothing. John says nothing. Paul says nothing. Paul wrote before the Gospels. His letters repeatedly defend the reality and significance of the resurrection. He attempts to persuade communities that the resurrection of Jesus is the foundation of their hope. If Paul had known that numerous dead saints had physically walked through Jerusalem, this would have been overwhelming evidence for his argument, yet he never uses it. Josephus records rebellions, executions, strange signs, prophetic movements, and disturbances in Jerusalem. He does not mention the dead returning. Philo does not mention it. Tacitus does not mention it. Suetonius does not mention it. No surviving Jewish, Roman, Greek, or pagan chronicler reports that multiple corpses emerged from tombs and entered a major city. The silence is not small. It surrounds the claim completely. When an event exists in only one late literary source, appears nowhere in earlier Christian writing, and leaves no trace in the historical environment where it supposedly occurred, the rational reader must ask whether the passage is reporting history or creating apocalyptic meaning. Matthew's scene resembles prophetic and visionary literature. Earthquakes, open tombs, shattered rocks, and the rising dead are signs of cosmic judgment. They announce that history has entered a decisive moment. The author is not satisfied with describing an execution. He wants the death of Jesus to rupture the boundaries between life and death, earth and heaven, past and future. The problem begins when readers are told that accepting the theological message requires accepting the scene as a documented public event. It does not. A literary image can express what an author believes without describing what a crowd literally witnessed. Spinoza's method teaches us to examine the origin and function of the passage. Why does this detail appear in Matthew and nowhere else? Why is it absent from the earliest gospel? Why does no later Christian writer use it as evidence? Why is the historical world outside Matthew completely silent? The simplest explanation is also the one institutions resist most strongly. The scene was composed. Matthew added an apocalyptic sign to show that the death of Jesus affected not only his followers, but the entire order of existence. The dead rising around Jerusalem are part of the author's theological architecture. They are not part of the recoverable historical record. Three extraordinary events now surround the death. The darkness covers the land, but no historian reports it. The temple veil tears, but no priest records it. Dead saints walk through Jerusalem, but no one outside Matthew mentions seeing them. Each detail is powerful as symbolism. Each collapses under the demand for independent confirmation. And this is precisely what Spinoza taught readers to notice. Do not ask only what a sacred text declares. Ask how the declaration was formed. Ask what earlier language it echoes. Ask whether other witnesses confirm it. Ask what the author needed the scene to accomplish. When the world outside a text remains silent, that silence cannot automatically be dismissed as hostility, ignorance, or divine mystery. Sometimes the world is silent because the event belongs to the story rather than to history. But the next problem is not cosmic. It concerns a man whose existence is independently documented. Pontius Pilate was real. The Pilate portrayed in the Gospels, however, bears little resemblance to the governor described by the people who knew his administration. Fact number 4. The Gospel's Pilate is not the Pilate recognized by history. Pontius Pilate served as the Roman governor of Judea. Unlike many secondary figures in the Passion narrative, he is confirmed by sources outside the New Testament. Philo of Alexandria wrote about him during the 1st century. Josephus described his actions in Judea. An inscription discovered at Caesarea confirms his title and position. The question, therefore, is not whether Pilate existed. The question is what kind of man he was. The historical sources present a governor known for harshness, provocation, and violence. Philo describes Pilate's administration through accusations of corruption, insult, robbery, execution without trial, and relentless cruelty. Pilate was not portrayed as a sensitive official trapped between conscience and public pressure. He was portrayed as a man who governed through intimidation. At one point, he introduced Roman military standards bearing images connected to the emperor into Jerusalem. Because many Jews regarded such images as offensive to their religious law, protests followed. Pilate did not respond with patient negotiation. According to Josephus, he surrounded the protesters with soldiers and threatened them with death. On another occasion, Pilate used money from the temple treasury to finance an aqueduct. When a crowd protested, he sent soldiers disguised in civilian clothing among them. At a signal, the soldiers attacked. Many were beaten and killed. Eventually, Pilate was removed from office after his forces violently suppressed a Samaritan gathering at Mount Gerizim. He was not recalled because Rome considered him too compassionate. He was recalled because even within the violent structure of Roman provincial rule, his actions had become politically dangerous. Now compare this man with the Pilate presented in the Gospel narratives. The Gospel Pilate hesitates. He questions Jesus. He repeatedly attempts to release him. He announces that he finds no basis for condemnation. In Matthew, Pilate's wife sends him a warning about a disturbing dream. Pilate then stages a public ritual, washing his hands before the crowd and declaring himself innocent of Jesus' blood. This is not the behavior we would expect from the governor described by Philo and Josephus. A Roman prefect did not require permission from a local crowd to execute someone suspected of political sedition. He did not need to perform moral theater to protect himself from Jewish religious authorities. He possessed military power. He represented the emperor. He could order crucifixion quickly and without emotional debate. The contrast is so severe that it demands explanation. Why would the gospel writers transform a brutal Roman official into a reluctant participant? The answer may lie in the political world in which the Gospels were written. The earliest Christian communities existed under Roman rule. A movement proclaiming that its founder had been executed as King of the Jews could easily be interpreted as politically dangerous. The accusation placed above the cross was not theological. It was imperial. Rome crucified people who threatened order, challenged authority, or symbolized rebellion. As Christianity expanded among non-Jews throughout the empire, its writers had a powerful incentive to reduce Roman responsibility and increase the responsibility assigned to Jewish leaders and crowds. The narrative gradually shifts the moral burden. Pilate becomes hesitant. The crowd becomes demanding. The governor appears almost innocent. The people insist upon death. This literary decision did not remain harmless. For centuries, accusations that the Jews killed Christ were used to justify persecution, expulsion, forced conversion, and massacre. A narrative strategy developed under Roman domination later became a weapon against generations who had nothing to do with the execution. Historical reading, therefore, carries moral consequences. If Pilate ordered crucifixion, he did so as a Roman governor, enforcing Roman power. The attempt to turn him into a compassionate man, overruled by a Jewish crowd, does not fit what is known of his administration. The difference is not a minor character variation. It reveals the political pressure shaping the story. A text is never written outside history. Authors live under governments. Communities fear persecution. Movements adapt their language to survive. Spinoza understood that scripture emerged from human circumstances. To understand a text, we must understand not only what it says, but why its writers may have needed to say it that way. And within the same trial scene, another historical problem appears. Pilate does not merely hesitate. He offers the crowd a choice between Jesus and a prisoner named Barabbas, supposedly following an annual Roman custom. Yet no evidence survives that this custom ever existed. Fact number 5. The Barabbas custom has no foundation in Roman history. The Gospels describe Pilate offering to release one prisoner during the festival. The crowd may choose Jesus or Barabbas. Barabbas is presented as a rebel, prisoner, or murderer connected with an uprising. The crowd chooses him, while Jesus is sent to crucifixion. The scene is among the most dramatic moments in the Passion narrative. Two prisoners stand before the people. One represents innocence, the other represents violence. The crowd is given a choice and chooses the guilty man. The moral symbolism is unmistakable, but the historical basis is missing. No surviving Roman legal code describes an annual practice in which a provincial governor released a condemned prisoner according to the wishes of a local crowd. Josephus does not mention such a custom. Philo does not mention it. Roman administrative records do not preserve it. No parallel is known from other Roman provinces. The practice appears only in the Gospel accounts. This absence becomes even more serious when we consider what Roman crucifixion was intended to accomplish. Crucifixion was political spectacle. It was public, humiliating, and deliberately terrifying. Rome used it to demonstrate what happened to slaves, rebels, bandits, and enemies of imperial order. The punishment communicated a message. Resistance is useless, and Rome controls both your body and your death. Against that background, the Barabbas custom becomes difficult to believe. Passover brought enormous crowds to Jerusalem. Roman authorities feared unrest during religious festivals because large gatherings could become politically volatile. Would Rome create an annual tradition allowing that same crowd to select a political prisoner for release? Would an empire known for crushing rebellion invite pilgrims to free a rebel every year? Such a practice would not merely be generous, it would undermine the logic of imperial deterrence. The narrative, however, requires the custom because it gives the crowd direct responsibility. Pilate does not simply order the execution. He asks the people to choose. They are offered Jesus. They demand Barabbas. The governor's hands appear tied by their decision. This is the same narrative movement seen in Pilate's hand-washing. Roman responsibility is softened, and Jewish responsibility is intensified. The scene functions perfectly as theology and drama. Barabbas becomes the guilty person released, while the innocent one dies in his place. The exchange resembles the later Christian doctrine that the guilty are freed because Jesus accepts punishment. Even the name Barabbas carries symbolic force. In Aramaic, it may be understood as Son of the Father. The crowd is presented with two figures: Jesus, identified within Christian belief as the Son of the Father, and Barabbas, whose name may also mean Son of the Father. One is chosen for freedom, the other is chosen for death. The literary construction is elegant, but elegance is not evidence. Once we recognize that the annual release custom lacks historical support and contradicts Roman political practice, the scene appears less like remembered procedure and more like purposeful composition. That does not mean every individual in the story was invented. It means the narrative has been arranged to communicate a message and distribute guilt. And once we see the author making that choice, we must examine the remainder of the trial with equal care. Fact number 6. The trial violates the very legal procedures it is supposed to represent. According to Mark and Matthew, Jesus is arrested at night and taken before Jewish authorities. Witnesses are questioned. Accusations are presented. A judgment is reached. By morning, Jesus is delivered to Pilate. The entire process moves with remarkable speed. Within hours, Jesus passes from arrest to religious condemnation, Roman questioning, scourging, crucifixion, death, and burial. The pace serves the narrative, but it creates historical and legal difficulties. Later, rabbinic sources preserve rules governing capital cases before the Sanhedrin. Such cases were not to be completed at night. They were to be heard during the day. A guilty verdict could not be finalized immediately. Judges were expected to delay the final condemnation, allowing time for reflection before confirming a death sentence. The reason is understandable. A legal system that cannot reverse an execution must create barriers against haste. A judgment involving death should not be made under pressure, emotion, or darkness. Yet the gospel accounts portray the highest Jewish authorities doing precisely what the legal safeguards were designed to prevent. They gather at night. They conduct the hearing at night. They reach condemnation at night. They transfer the prisoner at dawn. To accept the scene as straightforward history, the reader must believe that the leading legal authorities in Judaism collectively abandoned their most serious procedures for one Galilean preacher. Every participant agrees to the violation. No judge objects. No one demands delay. No one argues that the hearing should resume in daylight. No one invokes the rules protecting a defendant in a capital case. This is possible only if the court was acting with extraordinary illegality, or if the gospel writers, composing decades later in Greek-speaking environments, did not accurately understand the procedures of a formal Sanhedrin trial. The second possibility becomes stronger when another problem is added. The hearing supposedly occurs during Passover. The city is under intense religious obligation. Priests, families, pilgrims, and legal authorities are occupied by the festival. The idea that the entire machinery of arrest, testimony, judgment, Roman referral, execution, and burial was compressed into this sacred period raises further questions. Why act with such urgency? If the authorities feared unrest, they could have waited until the festival ended and the crowds left Jerusalem. Why conduct a complicated capital case at the moment when the city was fullest and public emotion highest? Why gather the leadership at night when normal religious and legal life was disrupted by the feast? The story answers through dramatic necessity. Jesus must die at Passover because the timing gives theological meaning to his death. The narrative is arranged around sacred symbolism. The historical actors are then required to perform whatever actions are necessary to place the crucifixion inside that symbolic schedule. This is where literary purpose begins controlling chronology. The writers want the betrayal, arrest, trial, execution, and burial to unfold within a compressed final sequence. The result is powerful storytelling. One event drives the next. The pressure never releases. Night becomes morning. Judgment becomes execution. The reader is carried forward before there is time to ask whether the institutions involved could have operated in that way. But when we slow the story down, the mechanism becomes visible. A trial is not merely a dramatic conversation. It requires jurisdiction, procedure, authority, witnesses, deliberation, a legal sequence. When those structures are ignored, the scene may still reveal how a later community understood the rejection of Jesus, but it cannot automatically be treated as a transcript of a lawful historical proceeding. There is also a deeper psychological reason people resist examining the trial. The story has been repeated so often that its sequence feels inevitable. Judas betrays. The guards arrest. The council condemns. Pilate hesitates. The crowd chooses Barabbas. Jesus is crucified. Each step has been joined to the next through centuries of art, ritual, preaching, and memory. The narrative no longer feels like a collection of ancient texts. It feels like something the listener personally witnessed. Familiarity creates the illusion of certainty, but repetition does not transform contradiction into fact. A story can become emotionally permanent while remaining historically unstable. Spinoza's challenge is to separate inherited familiarity from evidence. How do you know what you think you know? Because the accounts agree? They often do not. Because independent records confirm the scenes? Frequently, they do not. Because the story has always been told in one continuous form? That continuous form was constructed by combining multiple sources. The trial is therefore not merely a question of ancient law. It becomes a test of intellectual freedom. Can you permit a familiar narrative to become unfamiliar? Can you examine what your emotions have already declared untouchable? Can you acknowledge that a story may have shaped your life and still contain historical problems? Understanding begins at the moment we stop demanding that reality protect our inherited certainty, and the next fracture is impossible to solve by appealing to missing archives or legal exceptions. It sits directly inside the New Testament. The four Gospels do not agree on the date of the crucifixion. Fact number 7. The Gospels disagree about which day Jesus died. Mark, Matthew, and Luke describe the Last Supper as a Passover meal. Jesus gathers with his disciples. The meal is prepared. They eat together. Blessings are spoken. A hymn is sung. Afterward, Jesus goes to Gethsemane, where he is arrested. He is crucified the following day. In this sequence, the meal occurs after Passover has begun, and Jesus dies on the day of Passover itself. John presents a different chronology. In John's account, when Jesus is brought before Pilate, the Passover meal has not yet been eaten. The authorities avoid ritual defilement so that they may still eat the Passover. John explicitly places the trial on the day of preparation. Jesus is executed before the festival meal. This means that in the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, Jesus eats the Passover and dies afterward. In John, Jesus dies before the Passover meal takes place. These cannot both be the same chronology. The difference is not a matter of translation. It is not a minor variation in how ancient people counted hours. It concerns the placement of the central event of Christianity in relation to the most important festival in the story. Why would John change the date? Because John's theology gives Jesus the symbolic role of the Passover lamb. In the temple, lambs were slaughtered in preparation for the meal. John arranges the death of Jesus so that it coincides with that sacrificial moment. The chronology serves the symbol. Jesus does not merely celebrate Passover. He becomes the Passover sacrifice. John's version is therefore theologically precise, even if it conflicts with the earlier gospel sequence. This is exactly the kind of evidence Spinoza asks us to examine. When two accounts differ, the task is not to invent a complicated scenario in which both secretly agree. The task is to ask what each author is doing. Mark may preserve one tradition. John may reshape the chronology to express another theological meaning. The contradiction is not an embarrassment to be hidden. It is evidence of authorship. A human writer has made a decision. This is what institutions often fear most, not that the text contains minor errors, but that the text reveals deliberate construction. Once we see the authors shaping chronology, characters, and scenes, the Bible no longer appears as a single voice descending untouched from heaven. It becomes a library. Different writers, different communities, different concerns, different interpretations of the same inherited tradition. This does not make the texts worthless. It makes them human. But human texts must be read as human texts. Their differences cannot be erased, simply because later theology requires complete harmony, and the disagreement over the day is followed by another chronological conflict. Fact number 8. The Gospels disagree about the hour of crucifixion and the final words of Jesus. Mark states that Jesus was crucified at the 3rd hour. Using the ordinary ancient division of daylight, this means approximately 9 in the morning. John says that Jesus was still before Pilate at about the 6th hour, approximately noon. In Mark, Jesus has already been on the cross for several hours, when John still has Pilate presenting him to the crowd. The difference is not a few minutes. It is roughly 3 hours. For the most important execution in Christian memory, the accounts do not give the same sequence. Various attempts have been made to reconcile the difference. Some propose that John used a different system of counting time. Others suggest that one author was speaking approximately. But these explanations often begin with the assumption that contradiction is impossible, and then search for any scenario that preserves that assumption. Spinoza's method moves in the opposite direction. Read what each author actually wrote. Do not force agreement where the documents do not provide it. If Mark places the crucifixion at 1 hour and John places the sentencing at a later hour, the texts differ. That difference may reveal separate traditions, symbolic intention, imperfect memory, or authorial freedom. What it does not reveal is a single, precise eyewitness chronology. The last words of Jesus deepen the problem. In Mark and Matthew, Jesus cries out in Aramaic, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The line comes from the beginning of Psalm 22. Within the narrative, the words communicate abandonment, anguish, and the unbearable silence of God. Luke gives Jesus a different final statement. "Father, "Into your hands I commend my spirit." This line expresses trust and surrender. Luke's Jesus does not die asking why God has abandoned him. He dies in confidence, placing himself into the Father's care. John presents yet another conclusion. It is finished. Here, the final moment is not abandonment or surrender. It is completion. The mission has reached its appointed end. 3 Gospels offer 3 theological portraits of death: the abandoned sufferer, the trusting son, the victorious figure completing his work. Later Christian tradition often combines these sayings into a sequence known as the 7 last words. In sermons and devotional practice, sentences from different Gospels are arranged as though one witness heard Jesus say all of them in order. But no Gospel contains that harmonized sequence. It is a later construction. Each author chose the final words that expressed his own understanding of Jesus. Mark's ending emphasizes suffering. Luke emphasizes trust. John emphasizes fulfillment. The differences are not random. They reveal the theology of each narrative. This is where the issue becomes personal for many readers. Perhaps you once opened the Gospels and compared them side by side. Perhaps you noticed that the women at the tomb were not the same. Perhaps you noticed that Jesus' words changed. Perhaps you noticed that one account placed events in Galilee while another centered everything in Jerusalem. And perhaps, the moment you saw the differences, you felt fear. Not fear of the text, fear of yourself. You may have thought careful reading was a form of disobedience. You may have been taught that confusion revealed spiritual weakness. You may have closed the book because the questions felt dangerous. But noticing a contradiction is not a moral failure. It is an act of attention. The knot in your stomach did not prove that you lacked faith. It may have been your mind refusing to call 2 different statements identical. Reason does not become evil because an institution finds it inconvenient. Spinoza paid a severe price for insisting upon this freedom. He understood that communities often protect identity by controlling interpretation. A question about a text can be experienced as an attack upon the group itself. That is why doubt becomes shame. The questioner is made to feel disloyal. The reader is told that the problem lies not in the contradiction, but in the heart noticing it. Yet clarity begins when shame ends. You are permitted to read 4 accounts as 4 accounts. You are permitted to ask why they differ. You are permitted to recognize the authorial choices inside them. A text does not become stronger when readers are forbidden to examine it. Truth does not need fear to defend it. If you have ever seen these differences and believed you were alone, you were not. Many readers have noticed them. Many scholars have studied them. Many clergy members learned about them in classrooms and then returned to churches where the harmonized version continued to be preached. The silence surrounding these issues is not evidence that the problems are insignificant. Sometimes silence is institutional strategy. If the contradiction is never named, the congregation never has to decide what it means. But we are not finished. The chronology differs. The final words differ. The characterization of Pilate differs from history. The legal procedure fails to fit its setting, and the burial that follows creates another series of problems. Because Roman crucifixion did not normally end with a dignified private tomb. Fact number 9. The burial described in the Gospels conflicts with the ordinary purpose of crucifixion and the customs surrounding executed criminals. Crucifixion was not designed merely to end a life. Rome possessed faster methods of killing. A sword could kill quickly. Strangulation required less labor. Execution by other means could be completed away from public view. Crucifixion was chosen because it prolonged humiliation and displayed power. The condemned person was placed where travelers, residents, soldiers, and potential rebels could see what Rome had done. The body itself became part of the warning. In many cases, corpses remained exposed after death. Birds and animals consumed them. Decay continued in public. The denial of honorable burial intensified the punishment. The message extended beyond the individual. Rome controlled whether you lived. Rome controlled how you died. Rome could even deny you the dignity normally granted to the dead. Josephus describes crucifixions in Judea and the terror they produced. Thousands were executed during periods of unrest. Against that background, the gospel burial appears unusual. Jesus is executed under a political charge. The inscription identifies him as King of the Jews. From the Roman perspective, this title places the execution within the language of sedition, yet the body is not left exposed. A respected man named Joseph of Arimathea approaches Pilate and requests it. Pilate grants permission. Jesus is removed from the cross, wrapped in linen, and placed in a rock-cut tomb. In some accounts, the burial includes spices and considerable care. The body of an executed political prisoner receives treatment closer to that of an honored person than a condemned rebel. Could Roman authorities ever release a crucified body? Exceptions may have occurred. History is rarely governed by absolute uniformity. But the gospel narrative requires more than a theoretical exception. It requires the cooperation of the same Pilate portrayed by external sources as violent and inflexible. This governor must grant an honorable burial to a man executed under a royal claim during a politically sensitive festival at the request of a Jewish council member. The request itself carries risk. Approaching the Roman governor to claim the body of someone executed as a rebel could expose Joseph to suspicion. It could suggest sympathy with the condemned man. Yet Joseph enters the story without preparation. He has not appeared among the disciples. He has not defended Jesus during the trial. He has not been established as part of the movement. At the precise moment when the narrative requires a tomb, Joseph appears. After the burial, he largely disappears. This makes him indispensable. Without Joseph, there is no known tomb. Without a known tomb, there can be no narrative of women arriving at that specific location. Without that location, the empty tomb tradition loses its setting. Joseph provides the bridge between crucifixion and resurrection. But the historical record outside the Gospels offers no independent confirmation of him. He is not mentioned by Paul. This is significant because Paul wrote before the Gospel narratives and summarized the death, burial, and resurrection tradition. Paul says that Jesus was buried, but he does not identify Joseph or describe a rich man's tomb. Joseph appears when the later narrative needs specificity. A name, a social position, a private burial place, a stone, a location that can later be discovered empty. The tomb is also described as new and unused. From a narrative perspective, this detail is convenient. If the tomb contained other bodies, bones, or remains, confusion could arise about what had disappeared. An unused tomb eliminates that problem. Only one body is placed inside. If it is absent later, the meaning appears clear. But the very neatness of the arrangement invites scrutiny. A newly cut tomb owned by a wealthy man would have been valuable. Such tombs were family spaces, intended for repeated use across generations. Why would a council member surrender it for the body of a condemned stranger? Why would Pilate allow the burial? Why would the event leave no trace outside the later narratives? The Gospel writers provide theological reasons, but not independent historical support. Jewish burial law adds another layer. The Torah contains a requirement that an executed person should not remain hanging overnight. Burial before sundown protected the land from defilement. This may explain why a body was removed. But removal does not automatically imply burial in a rich man's private tomb. Executed criminals could be placed in dishonorable burial grounds designated for the condemned. The requirement to bury does not mean the person received an honored family interment. The Gospel story combines Roman permission, Jewish urgency, a wealthy benefactor, an unused tomb, linen wrapping, and precise timing before sunset. Every element prepares the next scene. The stone closes. The location is known. The women observe. The Sabbath begins. The narrative pauses. Then, on Sunday morning, the tomb is opened. As literature, the transition is masterful. Death enters darkness. Silence covers the Sabbath. The audience waits outside the sealed tomb. But historical reading asks a different question. Was the burial remembered because it occurred in this exact way? Or was it narrated in this exact way because the resurrection story required a discoverable empty tomb? This question becomes even more important when we return to the earliest Christian writings. Paul emphasizes appearances of the risen Jesus. He lists individuals and groups who believe they saw him. His argument does not depend upon women discovering an empty tomb. He does not describe a stone being rolled away. He does not mention Roman guards. He does not identify Mary Magdalene as the first visitor. He does not name Joseph of Arimathea. The earliest surviving Christian testimony focuses on revelation and appearances, not on the detailed burial and discovery sequence later found in the Gospels. That does not prove that no burial occurred. It shows that the narrative became more elaborate over time. Names appear, scenes become visible, dialogue develops, settings become concrete. The story acquires dramatic structure. This pattern is common in the development of tradition. A foundational conviction exists first. Later, communities tell stories that give that conviction form. The belief that Jesus was raised may have preceded the empty tomb narrative in the form we now possess. A community convinced that he had appeared to followers could later ask, what happened to the body? Where had he been buried? Who discovered the tomb? What did they see? Who told them what it meant? Narrative answers fill conceptual gaps. Once established, those answers become part of collective memory. After several generations, believers may no longer distinguish between the earliest proclamation and the later dramatic form. Spinoza's historical method asks us to reverse this process. Separate the layers. Identify what appears earliest. Notice what develops later. Examine the interests of each writer. Do not assume that greater detail means greater historical accuracy. Sometimes detail increases because a story has had more time to grow. And when we finally reach the empty tomb, this process becomes impossible to ignore. The four gospel writers do not merely emphasize different aspects of the same scene. They disagree on who went, when they arrived, what they saw, where the messengers stood, what instructions were given, and what happened next. Fact number 10 is therefore not one contradiction. It is an entire network of contradictions surrounding the foundational event of Christianity. Fact number 10. The four empty tomb accounts differ on nearly every detail that can be checked. Begin with Mark. Mark is generally regarded as the earliest surviving gospel. 3 women go to the tomb: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. They arrive after sunrise. As they approach, they wonder who will move the stone. When they reach the tomb, the stone has already been rolled away. They enter and see one young man dressed in white, sitting inside. He tells them that Jesus has been raised and is not there. He instructs them to tell the disciples and Peter that Jesus is going ahead of them to Galilee. Then Mark ends with fear. The women flee. They tremble. They are bewildered. They say nothing to anyone because they are afraid. In the oldest recoverable ending, that is where the gospel stops. No appearance of Jesus to Mary Magdalene. No meeting with the disciples. No commission to preach to the world. No ascension. Only an empty tomb, a young man's announcement, and women running away in silence. Many modern Bibles include additional verses after this point, but they often place them in brackets or add a note explaining that the earliest manuscripts do not contain them. The longer ending summarizes resurrection appearances, missionary commands, signs, and ascension. Its language and style differ from the preceding gospel. The conclusion is widely regarded as a later addition. Someone, or some community, appears to have found Mark's original ending unsatisfactory. A gospel ending with frightened women who tell no one creates an obvious problem. How did the message spread? Where is the risen Jesus? Where is the triumphant conclusion expected by later believers? The additional ending supplies what the earlier text lacks. This is not a minor footnote. It demonstrates that Christian scribes and communities did not always transmit texts passively. They sometimes expanded them to resolve theological and narrative difficulties. The printed note in a modern Bible quietly acknowledges this history. Now turn to Matthew. Matthew reduces the number of women to 2, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. The setting changes dramatically. There is a great earthquake. An angel descends from heaven. The angel rolls away the stone and sits upon it. His appearance is dazzling. Roman guards, who appear only in Matthew's account, become terrified and collapse. The women receive instructions to tell the disciples that Jesus will meet them in Galilee. They run away with fear and great joy. Then Jesus himself appears to them on the road. Compare the scene with Mark. In Mark, the stone is already moved before the women arrive. In Matthew, the angel descends and moves it in a dramatic supernatural event. In Mark, the messenger is a young man inside the tomb. In Matthew, the messenger is an angel outside, sitting on the stone. In Mark, there are no guards. In Matthew, guards witness the event and faint. In Mark, the women tell no one. In Matthew, they run to tell the disciples and meet Jesus along the way. These are not merely different camera angles. They are different sequences. Now turn to Luke. Luke names Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and other women. The group is larger. They find the stone already rolled away. They enter the tomb. Instead of one young man or one angel, 2 men in dazzling clothing stand beside them. The message also changes. The women are not told that Jesus is going ahead to Galilee, so the disciples should travel there. They are told to remember what Jesus had previously said while he was in Galilee. The distinction matters. In Mark and Matthew, Galilee is the destination. In Luke, Galilee is part of the past. Luke keeps the resurrection appearances centered in Jerusalem and its surroundings. The disciples are instructed to remain in the city. This creates a geographical contradiction. Mark and Matthew direct the disciples north toward Galilee. Luke tells them to remain in Jerusalem. Both instructions cannot describe the same immediate plan. Now turn to John. John's account changes the opening again. Mary Magdalene goes alone. She arrives while it is still dark, before sunrise. She sees that the stone has been removed and runs to tell Peter and another disciple. At this point, she has not entered the tomb and has not seen an angelic messenger. Peter and the other disciple run to the tomb. They inspect it. They see the linen cloths. They leave. Mary remains outside weeping. Only then does she look inside and see two angels. When she turns around, she sees Jesus but mistakes him for the gardener. Jesus speaks her name. Recognition follows. The sequence bears little resemblance to Mark's. Who goes to the tomb? Mark says 3 women. Matthew says 2. Luke says a larger group. John begins with Mary Magdalene alone. When do they arrive? Mark says after sunrise. John says it is still dark. What happens to the stone? In Mark and Luke, it is already moved. In Matthew, an angel descends and moves it in front of the women and guards. Who is present? Mark has 1 young man inside, sitting. Matthew has 1 angel outside, seated on the stone. Luke has 2 men inside, standing. John initially has no messenger visible. Then 2 angels appear inside, followed by Jesus outside. What are the women told? Mark and Matthew direct the disciples toward Galilee. Luke changes the statement into a reminder about something said earlier in Galilee. John gives Mary a personal message for the disciples. What do the women do? Mark says they flee and tell no one. Matthew says they run to tell the disciples. Luke says they report what happened, though the men dismiss their testimony. John has Mary report the missing body, return, encounter Jesus, and then announce that she has seen him. What happens next? The answers diverge again. Matthew culminates in a meeting on a mountain in Galilee. Luke centers the appearances in Jerusalem and nearby Emmaus, followed by instructions to remain in the city. John includes appearances in Jerusalem and later adds a Galilean scene by the sea. The narratives can be combined only by creating a 5th story that no gospel writer actually wrote. The harmonizer must imagine that different groups arrived at different times, that some women separated from others, that angels moved positions, that the women first told no one and then later told everyone, and that Jesus directed disciples both to Galilee and to remain in Jerusalem. Such a reconstruction is theoretically possible only because almost any contradiction can be harmonized if enough invisible events are invented between the written lines. But that is not historical reading. It is rescue. It protects a predetermined conclusion by adding information the sources do not contain. Spinoza's method refuses this procedure. He would ask us to allow each author to speak in his own form. Mark tells one story. Matthew revises and expands it. Luke restructures it around Jerusalem. John creates a distinct and deeply personal encounter between Mary and Jesus. Each narrative expresses the theology of its writer and community. The differences are evidence of development. Mark's women run away in fear. Matthew adds guards, an earthquake, an angel descending from heaven, and an appearance of Jesus. Luke expands the witnesses and relocates the emphasis. John transforms the scene into recognition. Mary sees, but does not understand until she hears her name. These are not identical reports from 4 observers standing near the same tomb. They are literary interpretations of a tradition. The more the tradition develops, the more complete the scene becomes. Fear becomes proclamation. Silence becomes testimony. An anonymous young man becomes angels. The absence of Jesus becomes direct encounter. A brief ending becomes a global commission. This development does not necessarily reveal deliberate fraud by every writer. Human memory is more complicated. Communities retell experiences. Beliefs shape recollection. Symbols become scenes. Liturgical repetition makes interpretation feel like observation. Later storytellers inherit an earlier conviction and express it in increasingly concrete forms. A grieving movement may sincerely construct meaning without believing that it is inventing. People do this in ordinary life. A family repeats a story for decades. Each generation adds detail. The central emotional truth remains, but the exact words, order, and setting change. Eventually, no one remembers which details came from the original event and which came from the retelling. Sacred communities are not exempt from this process. In fact, sacred meaning may intensify it. The the stronger the belief, the more pressure there is for the story to express that belief perfectly. The empty tomb accounts therefore reveal not a single transparent event, but the growth of tradition. And once this is recognized, the entire final day must be reconsidered, because the contradictions are not isolated. They form a pattern. 10 fractures appear within a narrow sequence of hours. 3 hours of darkness are described, yet no independent historian, astronomer, or chronicler records them. The temple veil tears in the most sacred and heavily supervised space in Judaism, yet no priestly or rabbinic source preserves the event. Numerous dead saints emerge from tombs and enter Jerusalem, yet no writer outside Matthew mentions them. Pontius Pilate is transformed from a violent Roman governor into a reluctant official attempting to save Jesus. An annual prisoner release custom appears in the Gospels, but nowhere in Roman law or provincial practice. The Sanhedrin conducts a capital trial at night and reaches immediate condemnation under circumstances that conflict with known legal safeguards and the Passover setting. The Synoptic Gospels place the Last Supper and crucifixion on one schedule, while John moves the death of Jesus to another day so that it corresponds with the slaughter of the Passover lambs. Mark places the crucifixion at approximately 9 in the morning, while John still has Jesus before Pilate near noon. The final words change according to the theology of each writer. The burial requires a Roman exception, a wealthy council member who appears at the exact moment the plot needs him, and a new tomb that creates the necessary setting for the resurrection narrative. Then the 4 accounts of the empty tomb disagree about the visitors, the time, the stone, the messengers, the instructions, the geography, and the immediate result. One discrepancy might be dismissed. 2 might be called imperfect memory. 10, concentrated within the central story of the faith, reveals something more fundamental. The Passion narrative did not reach us as a single eyewitness report. It reached us through composition. The writers shaped inherited traditions using scripture, theology, community memory, and literary purpose. This becomes even clearer when we examine how many details of the final hours echo the Hebrew Bible. The soldiers divide Jesus' garments and cast lots. The imagery comes from the Psalms. The crowd mocks him and shakes its head. Again, the language resembles the Psalms. Jesus cries, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is the opening of Psalm 22. The righteous sufferer remains silent before accusers. The image recalls Isaiah. The piercing draws upon prophetic language. The offer of sour wine echoes the Psalms. The claim that none of his bones were broken connects the death to scriptural patterns surrounding righteous suffering and Passover. These parallels are not hidden. Matthew repeatedly announces that events occurred to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophets. The author shows his method. He reads scripture, identifies patterns, and constructs the life of Jesus so that it appears as the completion of those patterns. Traditional interpretation says prophecy predicted the events. Historical criticism asks whether the events were narrated in those forms because the writers already possessed the prophetic texts. The direction of influence matters. Did soldiers unknowingly perform details from ancient poetry? Or did later authors use ancient poetry to describe what they believed the death of Jesus meant? Did eyewitnesses preserve exact scenes that happened to resemble scripture? Or did communities search scripture after the execution, looking for language capable of transforming catastrophe into purpose? The second possibility is psychologically powerful. Imagine the earliest followers after the death of their teacher. They had expected change. Perhaps they expected divine intervention, national restoration, moral transformation, or the arrival of God's kingdom. Instead, Rome executed him. Crucifixion did not merely kill a person, it publicly destroyed a claim. The victim was displayed as powerless. Followers scattered. Hope became shame. To continue believing, the community needed to reinterpret the defeat. They turned to their sacred texts. There they found the suffering righteous person, the rejected stone, the servant wounded and humiliated, the innocent sufferer surrounded by mockers, the vindicated one whom God would not abandon. These passages gave language to grief. The death no longer had to mean failure. It could become fulfillment. The execution could become sacrifice. The abandoned teacher could become the center of divine purpose. The movement could survive. This process is deeply human. It does not require us to imagine a group of cynical men deliberately inventing every line. People create meaning under pressure. They arrange memory around hope. They connect present pain to inherited stories. They transform loss into destiny because the alternative feels unbearable. The first followers may have been sincere. Their conviction may have been real. Their grief was real. The execution was likely real. The community that formed afterward was real. But sincerity does not guarantee historical accuracy. A person can believe a story completely and still inherit details that grew through retelling. This is the distinction institutions often refuse to make. Criticism is treated as accusation. If the narrative is not literal in every detail, then believers fear everything must collapse. But reality offers more possibilities than total inerrancy or total deception. A tradition can preserve memory and mythology together. It can contain history shaped by theology. It can reveal the emotional truth of a community without providing a precise chronological report. The Passion narrative may tell us less about the final 24 hours of Jesus than about what later Christians needed those hours to mean. That is why each author creates a different Jesus at the moment of death. Mark's Jesus enters abandonment. Luke's Jesus trusts. John's Jesus completes a cosmic mission. Each death answers the needs of a different theological vision. The same is true at the tomb. Mark ends in terror and silence. Matthew presents public supernatural triumph. Luke brings the story back to Jerusalem and prepares the way for the church in Acts. John creates an intimate encounter in which recognition comes through relationship. These are not failures of literary skill. They are evidence of literary purpose. The problem arises only when all four are flattened into one supposedly seamless report. That harmonized passion is not found in Mark. It is not found in Matthew. It is not found in Luke. It is not found in John. It exists in sermons, films, devotional books, church traditions, and the imagination of the believer. It is assembled by taking one author's darkness, another author's words, another author's trial scene, another author's burial detail, and another author's resurrection appearance. The pieces are stitched together. Contradictions are hidden beneath transitions. The resulting story feels complete because generations have repeated it as one. But the moment the seams become visible, the illusion of unity begins to break. This is what Spinoza offered, not the destruction of meaning, but liberation from forced interpretation. He asked readers to stop treating the Bible as though it had escaped the conditions governing every other human text. Language changes. Manuscripts develop. Authors have purposes. Political circumstances shape narratives. Communities preserve some memories and silence others. Editors combine traditions. Scribes add endings. Institutions decide which questions may be asked publicly. To understand Scripture honestly, we must permit it to be historical. That means allowing it to be complex, uneven, layered, human. The traditional account of Jesus' final day cannot survive in its familiar harmonized form, because that form depends upon erasing the differences between its sources. It did not happen exactly as the combined church narrative says it happened. It could not have occurred simultaneously on two different Passover chronologies. Jesus could not have been crucified at 9 a.m. while still awaiting sentence at noon. The women could not have arrived both after sunrise and while it was dark in the same single visit. They could not have encountered one messenger and two messengers in the same configuration. They could not have been told both to travel to Galilee and to remain in Jerusalem as the same immediate instruction. They could not have said nothing to anyone and immediately reported everything to the disciples in the same sequence. Without additional events, the texts never provide. The harmonized narrative asks the reader to supply those missing events. It survives through imagination disguised as explanation. Once that becomes clear, anger may arise, but the anger must be directed carefully, not toward the person who still believes, not toward the grandmother who prays, not toward the grieving person who finds comfort in the cross, not toward the ordinary believer who received the story from people they trusted. The responsibility lies more heavily with those who studied the manuscripts, learned the contradictions, understood the historical problems, and then chose to conceal them from the communities they served. Many clergy members encounter textual criticism in theological education. They learn that Mark's longer ending was added later. They learn about the different resurrection accounts. They learn that John uses a different chronology. They learn that the Gospels are anonymous compositions written decades after the events they describe. Then some return to the pulpit and speak as though none of this exists. The congregation receives certainty. The institution retains authority. The questions remain confined to classrooms and footnotes. This is not protection. It is control. It assumes that people cannot be trusted with complexity. It values obedience over understanding. It teaches believers to fear their own intelligence. Spinoza rejected this fear. For him, freedom did not mean believing whatever one desired. Freedom meant understanding causes, examining assumptions, and refusing to remain governed by emotions produced through ignorance. Fear makes people easier to control. Fear of damnation, fear of doubt, fear of community rejection, fear that one question will destroy an entire identity. But understanding changes the emotional structure. When you see how a story developed, it no longer possesses the same power to threaten you. You can examine it without terror. You can appreciate its symbolism without pretending that every scene is documented history. You can recognize the human beings behind the text. You can see their grief, hope, political vulnerability, and need for meaning. The result is not emptiness. It is solid ground. Ground does not become solid because an institution declares it sacred. It becomes solid because you can examine it, because it does not require you to deny what you see, because it can endure comparison, contradiction, and honest questioning. Perhaps the historical core is simple. A Jewish teacher lived in first-century Judea. He gathered followers. He entered conflict with political and religious powers. Rome executed him. His followers were devastated. Some later became convinced that death had not ended his significance. A movement formed. Stories developed. Scriptures were reread. Memories were shaped. Theology grew. Eventually, 4 different gospel writers created 4 different literary worlds around the same central figure. That story is still extraordinary. It is a story of grief becoming conviction, of defeat being transformed into meaning, of a small community refusing to disappear. But it should be told honestly. The human story does not need to be defended through claims that collapse under careful reading. You may have entered this examination with a narrative that seemed complete. Now you can see the fractures, the silence surrounding the darkness, the absence of the torn veil from priestly memory, the dead saints who exist only in Matthew, the rewritten character of Pilate, the invented or unattested Barabbas custom, the unlawful and compressed trial, the conflicting Passover chronologies, the contradictory hours and final words, the improbable burial, the incompatible empty tomb accounts. Holding these facts together may feel like loss at first, but clarity is not loss. The loss occurred earlier, when you were taught that your ability to question was dangerous. Clarity returns what fear took from you: your mind, your attention, your right to read, your right to compare, your right to say that 2 accounts do not agree when they do not agree. You were not the problem for noticing. You were paying attention. The story handed to you was not the final word. It was the beginning of an investigation. So ask yourself honestly, which of these 10 fractures changed the way you see the Passion narrative most deeply? Was it the silence surrounding the supernatural events, the historical Pilate, the conflicting chronology, the added ending of Mark, the incompatible resurrection stories? Share the one that affected you most, not as an act of hostility toward believers, but as an act of intellectual honesty. Someone else may be reading alone, carrying the same questions, believing they are the only person who has ever noticed. Your willingness to speak may release them from that isolation. And if this examination gave you language for something you have felt but could never express, share it with one person who may need that same clarity. Understanding begins when silence ends.